Welcome back, and thanks for joining me for a Bible study today. In Acts chapter 17, Luke records some events surrounding the work of the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul had gone to Thessalonica to preach the gospel, and he had some success in doing that, in people obeying the gospel, and the early beginnings of a church starting to form. However, his work came to a very abrupt end as he was persecuted by an opposition. Eventually, he had to leave town and went on to Berea. He had to leave town again and finds himself eventually in Athens. It was a very tumultuous couple of months in his life, to be sure, as his life was quite literally threatened. But having some time to reflect on his efforts in Thessalonica and the great concern that he had for newly converted Christians there, he wrote a letter. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul reflects on that abrupt end, on the persecution that arose, that the Thessalonians were still themselves having to contend with. And he tells them that he had tried to return. He had planned to return twice in this chaotic period of time, but was hindered. And the reason why he was hindered was because of the work of Satan. He lays blame for this at the feet of Satan. Satan had hindered him from returning to Thessalonica. Thinking about that hindering that occurred there with Paul, it begs to question, is Satan hindering us today? We certainly are living in a very distressing time. Our lives have been affected greatly by a global pandemic. And it would be helpful for us to consider how Satan could be using this pandemic to the detriment of our faith. So is Satan hindering you? To answer that question, we first must acknowledge the influence of Satan. Have you done that lately? There are a lot of people, even a lot of Christians, who really doubt the influence of Satan. It's as if Satan is just sort of a mythical cartoon kind of figure that has been invented over the time, but he's really not threatening. If you and I are going to take our faith seriously, then we have to acknowledge his real and present danger in the world as he tries to gain influence in our heart and mind. In Ephesians chapter 6, in verses 11 and 12, the Apostle Paul acknowledged the working of Satan, even as he did in that letter to the saints at Thessalonica. But in Ephesians 6 and verses 11 and 12, Paul describes Satan as someone who plots against us. He is plotting against us. He uses spiritual wickedness in high places to gain influence in the world. And as Paul was acknowledging that, he tells the saints at Ephesus that they need to put on the armor of God so that, number one, they can defend themselves against his weapons, against his assault, and that they might engage him in battle. Being a Christian is not just about protecting ourselves, it's about engaging the adversary. We need to acknowledge his influence in our world today. If he can use a global pandemic to destroy our faith, he will be content to do so. Secondly, we need to think about how Satan hinders us. How does he go about his work of gaining influence in our lives and in our world? Well, first of all, Satan hinders through deception. That certainly is how Jesus acknowledged Satan. In John chapter 8 and verse 44, Jesus describes Satan as being the father of lies. And if we go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, we find Satan in the form of a serpent deceiving Eve in the Garden of Eden. He deceived her and she bought his lie, and her life and the life of her husband and the life of the human family has never been the same since. So he can deceive us from the truth. Secondly, and certainly appropriate for the time in which we're living, Satan hinders us through fear. There are a lot of people who are afraid of what's going on in the world, and it's true, understandable to a certain extent. There's a lot of unanswered questions we have about a virus that's in our world. And because of the uncertainty that persists, we can become afraid and very fearful. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, though, in verse 7, the Apostle Paul makes it perfectly clear that fear does not come from God. That alone should be assuring to us. Paul tells Timothy that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but instead He's given us power and love and self-control. So when you and I are fearful in our lives because of what's going on in the world, whether it's the fear of a virus or anything else, we need to remember that that frame of mind is not coming from God. Instead, fear is one of the ways that the devil uses to affect our thinking and to paralyze us. If the devil can get us to stop altogether engaging him and engaging the world around us with the gospel of Christ, then he'll do that. Rather than being fearful, we need to have faith in the power of the gospel. Another way that Satan will hinder us is through division. Satan divides and conquers. He can divide churches. He can divide families. He can divide friends through a variety of ways. But if he can break the bonds that bring us together, he'll do that. Think about division in the context of a global pandemic. How is he using division with the pandemic today? Well, if you think about how we're trying to cope with it, we're practicing this thing called social distancing. People, social distancing coupled by fear, we're afraid to be around each other. And the bonds that tie us together are being strained because of it. We have all come to recognize in a new way, in a way that we never have before, the importance of human connection, the greatness of relationships, perhaps that we have taken for granted in the past. Well, those are some of the ways that Satan can hinder us. He can hinder us through deception, through fear, through division. But what can we do to overcome how he tries to gain influence, how he tries to hinder us? Well, certainly, number one, through faith. Faith is described by John in 1 John chapter 4 as being the means that we gain victory in the world. You and I need to have faith in the armor that God has given us to defend and engage our adversary. We need to have loyalty and commitment on display to Him, to His Word, to His church, to our fellow Christians as we try to encourage one another. Another thing that we can do to overcome Satan is through worship. You and I, we desperately need worship, and we always have. Perhaps we're recognizing it in a new way, though. We need to come together on the first day of the week to praise God for what He has accomplished for the human family through the Messiah. We need to worship to encourage and strengthen each other. That's so vital. It's so vital for us as the family of God to come together and to worship, to experience the community together of God as God's family. And thirdly, just generally, we need to support each other. As I said a moment ago, the ties that bind us together are relationships because of this separation, this fear of being around other people is straining our relationships. It's causing us to grow more and more distant from each other, not just in proximity, but in our relationships. Our relationships are being harmed because of it. So now more than ever before, perhaps, we need to support each other. What are you doing? What are you doing to strengthen your relationships? What are you doing to reach out and to encourage your friends and your neighbors, your family? What are you doing to encourage and strengthen saints of the local church? We need to be thinking in those terms about what we can do to strengthen and maintain our relationships. The further and further we grow apart from each other, that's called drifting. When we grow further and further apart from one another, further and further apart from Christ and what brings us together in Him, then we drift away from Him. And in drifting, our faith begins to weaken and strain. That's how Satan hinders us. That's how Satan slowly, incrementally, over the process of time, can destroy us. We've been suffering from this pandemic now since February, and it doesn't seem that there's any end in sight. So that makes it all the more important that you and I acknowledge how the devil can be using this to his advantage and to our detriment, and to chart a course. Perhaps we need to change our course and how we are trying to strengthen our faith and encourage the faith of one another. The cause of God, the cause of His church has not been changed because of this pandemic. We still have a responsibility. We still have the ability to have influence in the world, to find ways to strengthen our faith and to gain advancement for the cause of Christ, to make the gospel gain progress in the world, in our lives, and in our families. So in conclusion, I'll ask you again, is Satan hindering you? Is Satan hindering you personally in your faith? Is he hindering your family? Is he hindering your children? Certainly, this pandemic is affecting everyone. No one is escaping the challenges that this has brought upon us. We need God. We need His Word. We need the church. We need one another now more than ever before in our lives. So I hope that we'll take this message to heart and know that, yes, Satan certainly is trying to hinder us. However, because of the love of Christ, we can become more than conquerors. We can engage him and defeat him. We can overcome. Thank you, and I hope to see you next time in our next study. Thank you, and have a nice day.